Hello, everyone. I'm here with Walt Fritz, who's a physical therapist from New York, and he is coming over to the UK in March to teach his Foundations in Manual Therapy Voice and Swallowing class. Walt, how are you?
Stephen, I'm well. Thanks. Those small pauses are so important, aren't they?
Well, they're good for the edit, just in case.
That's perfect. Yes, I've been doing these myself, so I've been pacing my text. So in case I need to chop it, I've got time. Anyway, yes, I've been well. Thanks. Thanks for having me, and we are looking forward to our UK trip in March. That's for sure.
Yeah, and you and I are teaching a masterclass on the 8th of March. That's you and I kind of doing our stuff together with some people. That's pretty cool, isn't it?
It is, and what I liked about what our first one last year, it ended up being certainly much more than just my manual therapy work, right? It was almost like our work, as a
Mm.
team together. Both the concept of your, vocal coaching and all the good things you do, and then rolling in this and how those just slip in together almost seamlessly if you allow them, like a good relationship should. So it was a lot of fun. And that class that we had at the Cecil, it's Cecil, right? I want to get it
Yeah, it
right.
is. It is.
Cecil. Yeah. Yeah. See, we would say Cecil Sharp. The Cecil Sharp Center was it was a great space, and a good sized class. So I'm looking forward to that one more time.
Great. Great. Well,
Yeah. Yeah.
we, I mean, we're here to have a chat about what manual therapy is for this region of voice and swallowing and
Yeah.
have a look at some of the stuff that we usually chat about. So,
Yeah.
where do you
Yeah.
want to start with that?
Interesting takeoff, right? Because what manual therapy is for voice, maybe there's a delineation here. What manual therapy has been for voice, and I idealistically, where manual therapy for voice might be evolving, right? Because manual therapy for voice has been since 1990 about, you know, yanking the larynx around, laryngeal manipulation. And I know I get pretty pejorative about aggressive work, assertive work. Um, and I have full understanding that aggressive work works. It's shown that it's worked. But there's a part of me as a human being, as a receiver and a giver to a lesser extent, but as a receiver, that that assertiveness often feels borderline excessive, borderline assaultive, borderline dangerous to me as the individual receiving it. What I dislike about models that are simply one person as the operator, there's very little input given or requested from me, the receiver, to say, okay, does this feel safe? Right? That basic framework of is this a safe intervention, whether it's a physical safety or biopsychosocial or psychosocial safety, right? Um, and I'm never asked that except for small little questions like how's my pressure, or we'll be through with this quickly. Are you okay with that? Um, I think that laryngeal manipulation in its historic fashion possibly could even be more effective or possibly differently effective if if the invitation was made for during the interaction for the clinician to acknowledge the patient's part in this and give them at least some stake in it, some decision making in it, instead of how I've always felt when had laryngeal manipulation done to me is basically I'm just holding on to my chair or the table that I'm laying on, while this person does their thing, and then they'll start asking me stuff. So, to me, manual therapy doesn't have to be so assertive, so aggressive. And the concept of manipulation, there's other options out there. Um, I'm I've said this a lot, and I don't mean to be disrespectful of who is doing manipulation, right? Um, as well as the researchers who've written on laryngeal manipulation. But if you look at the origins of the concept of you need to be aggressive for it to work, Arnold Aronson said that in his 1990 book, Clinical Voice Disorders. He said, in order to have a lasting effect, you must be aggressive. But there was no footnote. There was no evidence to support that statement. It was a statement made, I'm guessing, from his own experience or the experience of people he knew, without any real sound backing for it. And then as you move forward in the literature, 1993, Nelson Roy basically said the same thing and used Aronson as a footnote to say, here's a reason why we need to be aggressive. Aronson said it in 1990. And And it's continuing to this day in various people writing and doing research on racial manipulation, saying, you have to be aggressive, and they're backciting all these things. And in a way, I think an entire industry was built on someone's opinion, which is fine, except don't act like it's fact. It works, but I think we can do different. And that's, Stephen, I'm sorry, I'm just taking up the conversation here. That that's my whole take, is not necessarily to be aggressive, or if assertiveness or aggressiveness is used, it's something that is appreciated or asked for by the patient through shared decision making versus me calling the shots.
That's what originally brought you and I together, wasn't it? I mean,
Mhm.
we met in London at my clinic in 2018, was it, or 2019?
2019. Yep,
And
2019.
we did a series of kind of Q&A stuff. I had hair back then.
Yeah,
You,
I
you,
did. I
you
didn't.
didn't.
I didn't.
But one of the things that really struck me was, particularly in the UK scene, this perpetuation of that aggressive narrative. That's how I
Yeah.
would call it. This, you've got to kind of grab onto the chair and hope for the best, and then pop to ibuprofen afterwards to calm the
Yeah.
swelling.
Yeah.
And
And I know that our clinicians insist that, oh no, I'm not being aggressive. Um, but I think that's a lot of things that you adapt to over time. That this is not aggressive work. We're doing what needs to be done.
mm,
Um, and you might be, for you as the giver, but how do you know what needs to be done until you open up that conversation to the patient and include them as actually having value in that relationship and sharing with you what they might feel effective? And I think
and
that's just problematic.
this is, I mean, you touched on the operator side, but you didn't follow up with the interactor side. So I'm wondering
Right,
if you
right.
could speak a little bit about the interactor model.
Yeah, the interactor model was one introduced to me by Diane Jacobs and Jason Silvernail in a 2011 paper, where they talked about the traditional operator model in physiotherapy, where the clinician is the expert applying their expertise, and the patient is the receiver, sort of in a subservient role. And what they talked about in that paper was the elevation of the patient to a role where the two individuals are interacting versus one having a distinct power advantage in that relationship. And I think what they were saying from a different language is what's become known as shared decision making throughout, healthcare, as well as a lot of other models. The concept of sharing decisions as equal. Now, it's never equal. We're never equal in a relationship. It's constantly fluxing back and forth. But I think a successful personal relationship is one where things tend to average out here. And I think not I think that in shared decision making in the research, that's the way it's envisioned, at least from an idealized standpoint. That I certainly come into this room of therapeutic interaction with my expertise, my education, my training, etc. But I need to acknowledge you as the expert in your life, in your lived experience. And I think shared decision making is simply elevating that person. And it takes a lot of work sometimes from someone who's not either willing, capable, or prepared to have power to elevate them and get them to participate. To me, I think that embodies this interactor approach where we're interacting with each other. There's so much work out there, research on touch and manual therapy, that shows that the input from us, the giver, matters. We're not researcher as observer, we're researcher as participant. And that's truly it. But yet there's so many people who are viewing, oh, look at that posture's poor. We need to fix that. That's working totally from an operator in perspective. Instead of saying, you know what, you talk about your posture as being causative. How do you view that? How does that feel to you? What would change if we, quote unquote, fixed your posture? I think we could do so many things to balance power. And again, I don't disacknowledge that those operator style of works don't work. They do, but I think we can make them work better.
And this is something I've been thinking about how we attend to what narratives work for us. Like, if our whole existence thus far in our lives has been operator led, right?
Mhm.
Hierarchical, perhaps even patriarchal in the model, then it feels difficult to then own our own part in that
Yeah,
healing or change. And
yeah,
you, before we came on, you were talking about a 2022 paper um, that I thought was really fascinating. Some really fascinating insights, which I think attend
yeah.
to that as well. The self capital S and how we might perceive ourselves in being touched and what that means for us.
Yeah, yeah. And just to back up just a moment, I think it's especially now, from your pedagogy model, that's a very different model from my healthcare model. And I know in the healthcare system, at least in the United States, there is definitely a hierarchy of the doctor, the clinician is the expert. And I think those are very difficult to get somebody to elevate themselves, to give themselves a voice. But what I had mentioned to you was back in, I think it was March of 2022, there was an entire issue of Frontiers in Psychology, which was devoted to touch. And the one paper that really struck me as one of those aha moment papers was a paper that was speaking to the concept of on how touch can connect us to our past. And just to give you a little historical context, um, I learned myofascial release, releasing the fascia in a very niche rabbit hole kind of concept and training, where every problem was deemed a fascial problem and every solution was deemed a fascial solution, a connective tissue solution. Where when we touch somebody, we're not touching their skin or impacting their muscle, we're relating to the fascia and their bound down fascia. And there were also concepts that said that emotions get stored in that bound down fascia. And the proof of that was that when we release their fascia, they often have an emotional awareness or an unraveling or an unwinding from those past emotions, traumas, etc. And post hoc fallacy is simple to get somebody to believe that when they have that relationship with their past, well, it must have been the fascia. And I learned it, that work, and I practiced it for a while, and then I stopped using it. I was really uncomfortable with, first of all, giving credit or responsibility to every problem to being fascia, as well as this singly held belief that emotions are stored in the fascia when the rest of medical science sees otherwise. But what this paper did was sort of turn a switch on for me. Because in the paper, Stephen, they talked about a parallel between psychotherapeutic interventions and touch itself. Now, they weren't referring to manual therapy touch, but touch itself. And, I ran this past you before we came on the air here, just because of your current training and where you're headed with your work. But in some psychotherapeutic interventions and models, that one of the tasks of the clinician is to attempt to maybe bring the patient to an awareness of how the past might have related to the present. All right. In this paper, they called that a person's priors. And they talked about that when touch is applied, it can often not cause, but allow the person to access that past relationship with the present. And they related to that as the priors. Touch can bring a person into contact with the priors. And the other aspect, which really, really rang my bell, was, in manual therapy and massage and myofascial release and all these various named modalities and unnamed modalities, the concept of palpation is a key evaluation tool where, we reach into a person and we palpate for the problem. Now, I no longer view what I palpated as the problem. And I've got a lot of different ways that we explain what it is that we're touching. And I just think we're looking for a doorbell that rings from here to here of awareness, right? But there was this concept that when we feel something, and I think, Stephen, you can relate to this, you feel something and you go, oh, that feels tight. And you might say something to them like, right there. And that's what I say all the time in here. And a lot of times when we do that, when we say, ooh, right there, they say, yes, that's it right there. And in this paper, they refer to that moment as a sense of synchrony between the clinician and the patient. And that synchrony, coupled with the concept of tapping into somebody's priors, allows them sort of a deeper look at themselves and how touch might be relatable and effective and helpful. And to me, what that did was it just sort of opened up a door and said, here it is, Walt. Here's a paper that explains some of your questions. Because my work is not about fixing or releasing or breaking this up. It's about creating a meaningful awareness to a person's own existence and their issue, and just opens the door for them to begin solving the problem on their own. So very cool paper, and if we've got the ability, we can kind of link that paper in the show notes here from this talk today, because I think it's a bit of a hard paper to get through, and they're relating this to prenatal and postnatal touch as well as developmental touch as well versus actual manual therapy touch. But I think without really jeopardizing integrity, I think you can relate these experiences to the work that you and I do and the kind of work that we all do in the clinic and teach, et cetera.
Yeah, that's fascinating. No, definitely we'll link that in. That'd be a really lovely addition. So, in terms of then, we've addressed where we think the work has come from and the Aronson aggressive stuff, and then you've mentioned your myofascial release background. I'm wondering where you think it's all headed. Like, one of the critiques of this shared decision making work seems to be that um, we'll ultimately end up getting hands off completely, or will it all be about the interview, and we'll be able to do it, just everything telehealth, everything over Zoom.
Yeah, yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing. If it's doable, if it's truly doable, then I don't know that there's any that's a negative. Although some people would really view it as a negative because they see it as their job being taken away from them. But I think there's still value from touch that people get from that. I in my classes now I teach an interaction that talks about the difference between self touch and social touch and how the receiver inputs that. And I relate that to a few papers that talk about what happens in a person's brain when they touch themselves versus somebody else touching them. And I think that's just a small slice of why touch can be impactful, not better, but differently than self-touch or non-touch. And I think that there certainly are people who touch is their relatable interaction style. Years ago, I used to do co-treatments with a psychotherapist who had patients who responded better from a somatic movement or touch-based perspective. And we'd work as in this triad where I'm working with touch-based work and the therapist would work with her work while the person was on our table. It was really fascinating work because certain people seem to relate better or differently to touch. I don't think it's going away. I hope what goes away is the ego-based model that I have the ability to find that secret pathology in you based on literally 100 different stories of what's wrong with people, their tissues, etc. I actually see shared decision making and some of these models working across the spectrum of my profession with exercise. I think we could do a lot of work with exercise beyond just, okay, I'm going to pull this out of my drawer. Here's the exercises we do for, shoulder surgery. And while those interventions work, I think that the individual, the therapist, the clinician can go a lot further to make this personalized for the person, that if this particular exercise doesn't quite hit the center of the brain that it needs to, well, let's go off script here. And that's kind of what we do with manual therapy is we're going off the script. Instead of saying, here's the direction we need to take the larynx, we say, okay, here's a place to start, patient, but where do we go from here? And I think that's the demarcation point between traditional models, whether they're aggressive or non-aggressive, and ideally more of a person-centered shared decision-making model is it's not about what needs to happen. It's about introducing a possibility and then allow it to be an interaction. In I like the word co-creation, where the patient and I, each session, each moment, are co-creating a useful intervention for them. I hope that's where manual therapy for voice is going. I hope that's where manual therapy in general is going.
Yeah, would be inclined to agree with you there on all fronts, and it just got me thinking as you were talking about how over the pandemic we lost ability for social touch mostly,
Mhm, mhm,
and how simple things now like handshakes or social greetings, hugs, or something like that
mhm.
can feel very impactful and very different. And there's
Yeah.
lots in the kind of psychotherapeutic realm about should we ever hug one of our clients? Should we ever shake hands with one of our clients?
Mhm,
And they have their own stories, right? But interesting to put it into this window and go, there's a there's a transmission that occurs in social touch, and that will activate something in both parties. I think that's an interesting thing. And we
yeah.
talk about transference in the psychotherapeutic field, what you remind me of or what I remind you of, or how we work with that. And there are some whole modalities which only work with transference and countertransference, right? Who who do I think you are? How can I manipulate this? But the transferential nature of touch
Mhm.
could be extremely rewarding to think about in terms of that way. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about the kind of people who have suffered abuse,
Yeah.
suffered physical abuse in the
Yeah.
region of the throat, etc., and how
Yeah.
reparative, when done in a shared decision making way, safe touch might be.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, there's so much research on the affective nature of touch in terms of, almost that psychosocial nature of touch. Some, I believe, some clinicians, when they're confronted, if you will, or presented with that sort of a model, often feel, disconnected from it because most of what's taught in my training and their training is about that biomechanical type of tissue based model. And when someone comes and says, some of this could be contextual factors, it could be, that nasty word placebo, or it could be the sense that touch allows safety, allows somebody to work through their stuff, even though that you might not be aware of that. I think there's a sense of diminishment of a clinician's, skill level. But in I think what's happening is you're just allowing other factors to roll into why a person improves, why a person changes. Christopher Moyer, who was a United States PhD, has written a lot on massage and also a couple good papers on the effective nature of massage. And working with repeated massage has demonstrable changes with trait anxiety. And I think that's really important. Not that we can see ourselves as mental health therapists, right? But understanding that contextually appropriate and agreed upon touch can be very therapeutic at a lot of different levels. And we harken back to that biopsychosocial nature of this work, and you can't remove bio from the psychosocial. Every time we touch, they're all at play. Knowing that, I think number one, allows us to set up better boundaries and safety, right? But also potentially asking questions of what do you feel, not do you feel your pain? And I think we've got a lot of work to do, but I think work is being done.
And it strikes me as being potentially even more problematic to look at vocal massage, as I call it, through the
Mhm.
aggressive lens. Therefore,
Yeah,
if
yeah,
we take into account context sensitive or context sensitivity in
yeah,
the work.
yeah. Yeah, and it's a tough one. I realize it's a tough one as I kind of travel around the world, and I talk about this concept: is laryngeal manipulation too aggressive, or are we not giving the patient enough input? And what I'm really doing is rattling people's cages, not just their cages, but the icons that they've followed and maybe trained with. which is tough stuff, man. When you start messing with people's gurus and icons and what the literature is just cemented in that this is what works, I think I get a lot of pushback. I really do. But I'm willing to just stand there and really face that. It's like I'm not diminishing its value. What I'm just doing is simply offering the possibility that there are other options that might be as effective. Now, I know that I've got work to do and others have work to do to say, okay, let's do some research on this more, maybe a more sustained input that I do, a lighter, gentler kind of work, as well as adding in shared decision making. We've got work to do to bring that into the literature to say, you know what, here's some studies that show it is effective. It's tough. I'm sure there's a way, and I'm not a researcher. I'm sure there's a way to do a head-to-head comparison, if you will, of aggressive laryngeal manipulation and this more slow, shared decision-making model. And I'm hoping somebody with some research chops can kind of take that and run with it. But really, when you really read other people's comments, there's a lot of comments that talk about that there's so many different ways that we do this work, and they all seem to be effective. But yet that's somehow like singled out and say, no, we have to crank on this person's larynx in order to get it back where it belongs, which that whole, does a high larynx really mean what we think it means? That's a whole nother topic. When I really want to irritate people in a seminar, I'll bring that up. Okay. But that's for another podcast, or that's for another interview,
Well,
Stephen.
do you
All
know
right.
what's really funny is Ginevra and I actually did a podcast episode on that last year. Does my high larynx really matter? So
And
anybody listening to this,
interject.
go back and listen.
Yeah. And is it, even if it does matter, is it going to stay where we think we put it? Right. Whether it's behaviorally or manual therapy wise, is it going to stay down where society thinks our larynx should be? Or possibly are we simply giving the person, the patient, the client, the ability to see variation, to have awareness that they have choice in this matter, right? I don't know. We all have these simplistic historical sort of fairy tales on what should be and what must be, right? And what's wrong. And once we can kind of sort of, with I think maturity, see that maybe those are just simple lessons we learned early on that don't necessarily kind of like check out in terms of fact. I just think we have more work to do until we can do that.
I think that's a very astute observation there, Walt. Very
It's
astute.
a mature observation.
Am I mature now that I'm bald?
You are, yeah, yeah, much more
Great,
mature.
great.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
So you've got some one-off seminars happening, online seminars. Is that right?
Yeah, I started a first one literally last night called the Deeper Dive series. We did tongue tips last night where we got together for an hour, and I kind of went through a lot of different things on the tongue, not just the stuff I teach in the class, but the concept of introducing and overlapping the concept of strengthening with stretching and how they might not be so walled off as some people think. Um, but yeah, I'm going to try and do a monthly series of those, and they're hour long, reasonably priced. Some of them are going to be free. We're going to do another one coming up soon that I just kind of thought of last night. It's like, what's my beef with myofascial release? Why do I keep hammering myofascial release? So I'm going to do a freebie on that one. But yeah, they're kind of fun, and we put those up on the website. I've got 5 online courses that I filmed this past summer, and the first one is ready for release. Um, Including my advanced class, which is going to be a first. That'll be an interesting one, the advanced voice and swallowing class. And I'm really excited about, you know, first of all, like you said, during the pandemic, when we became virtual, can you teach manual therapy virtually? And I used to say, no, you can't. And then I said, well, you can, but it's not as good. And now I say, you can, and it might be differently good, right? I still think there's benefit to the interaction that you can get when we do a live class. But I also think there's a lot of information that we can translate in mediums that previously had been said did not work for this work. So yeah, I'm excited about that. I've got a lot of classes coming up, US and international, and I've got my book coming out, knock on wood, in March, manual therapy for manual therapy in voice and swallowing, a person-centered approach. And that's really diving deep into the science, the evidence, not only behind touch, but under shared decision making, and then the rest of the book is just this journey through the body on manual therapy and how it can be impactful for um, voice, swallowing, oral motor, tongue, breathing disorders, and related problems. So that's exciting.
Wowzers. I mean, we're together in March. Your teaching assistant in March as well as us doing the
Yeah,
masterclass together?
yep, yep, yep. You are my flunky. You are my flunky, and then we have to turn to our master class, and all of a sudden you're my equal.
Yeah.
We're going to share decision making in the master class, and I'm going to operate from an operator perspective in my class because you will be my teaching assistant.
I love that. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much for your time today. I'm really looking forward
Thanks
to
for your
speaking
time.
again in
Yeah,
person.
yeah.
All right. Cheers.
All right. Bye.
We hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe and share. It helps us get a much wider reach.